Welcome to a fireside reading of A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. Chapter 14, Part 1. Most of life is so dull that there's nothing to be said about it, and the books and talk that would describe it as interesting are obliged to exaggerate in the hope of justifying their own existence. Inside its cocoon of work or social obligation, the human spirit slumbers for the most part, registering the distinction between pleasure and pain, but not nearly as alert as we pretend. There are periods in the most thrilling day during which nothing happens, and though we continue to exclaim, "I do enjoy myself," or "I am horrified," we are insincere. As far as I feel anything, it is enjoyment. Horror, it's no more than that, really, and a perfect, adjusted organism would be silent. It so happened that Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested had felt nothing acutely for a fortnight, ever since Professor Godbole had sung his queer little song. They had lived more or less inside cocoons, and the difference between them was that the elder lady accepted her own apathy while the younger resented hers. It was Adela's faith that the whole stream of events is important and interesting, and if she grew bored, she blamed herself severely and compelled her lips to utter enthusiasms. This was the only insincerity in a character otherwise sincere, and it was indeed the intellectual protest of her youth. She was particularly vexed now because she was both in India and engaged to be married, which double event should have made every instant sublime. India was certainly dim this morning, though seen under the auspices of Indians. Her wish had been granted, but too late. She could not get excited over Aziz and his arrangements. She was not the least unhappy or depressed, and the various odd objects that surrounded her, the comic Purdah carriage, the piles of rugs and bolsters, the rolling melons, the scent of sweet oils, the ladder, the brass-bound box, the sudden eruption of Mahmud Ali's butler from the lavatory with tea and poached eggs upon a tray, they were all new and amusing and led her to comment appropriately, but they wouldn't bite into her mind. So she tried to find comfort by reflecting that her main interest would henceforward be Ronnie. What a nice, cheerful servant. What a relief after Anthony. They startle one rather. A strange place to make tea in, said Mrs. Moore, who had hoped for a nap. I want to sack Anthony. His behaviour on the platform has decided me. Mrs. Moore thought that Anthony's better self would come to the front at Simla. Miss Quested was to be married at Simla. Some cousins with a house looking straight onto Tibet had invited her. Anyhow, we must get a second servant, because at Simla you will be at the hotel, and I don't think Ronnie's Baldeo. She loved plans. Very well. You get another servant, and I'll keep Anthony with me. I am used to his unappetizing ways. He will see me through the hot weather. I don't believe in the hot weather. People like Major Callender, who always talk about it, it's in the hope of making one feel inexperienced and small, like their everlasting, I've been 20 years in this country. I believe in the hot weather, but never did I suppose it would bottle me up as it will. For, owing to the sage leisureliness of Ronnie and Adela, they could not be married till May, and consequently Mrs. Moore could not return to England immediately after the wedding, which was what she had hoped to do. By May, a barrier of fire would have fallen across India and the adjoining sea, and she would have to remain perched up in the Himalayas waiting for the world to get cooler. I won't be bottled up, announced the girl. "I've no patience with these women here who leave their husbands grilling in the plains. Mrs. McBride hasn't stopped down once since she married. She leaves her quite intelligent husband alone half the year, and then, surprised, she's out of touch with him. She has children, you see." "Ah, yes, that's true," said Miss Quested, disconcerted. "It is the children who are the first consideration, until they are grown up and married off. When that happens, one has again the right to live for oneself, in the plains or the hills, as suits." "Oh, yes, you're perfectly right. I never thought it out. If one has not become too stupid and old." She handed her empty cup to the servant. "My idea now is that my cousins shall find me a servant in Simla, at all events to see me through the wedding, after which Ronnie means to reorganize his staff entirely. He does it very well for a bachelor. Still, when he's married, no doubt various changes will have to be made. His old servants won't want to take their orders from me, and I don't blame them." Mrs. Moore pushed up the shutters and looked out. She had brought Ronnie and Adela together by their mutual wish, but really she could not advise them further. She felt increasingly, vision or nightmare, that though people are important, the relations between them are not, and that in particular too much fuss has been made over marriage. Centuries of carnal embracement, yet man is no nearer to understanding man. And today she felt this with such force that it seemed itself a relationship, itself a person who was trying to take hold of her hand. "Anything to be seen off in the hills?" "Only various shades of the dark." "We can't be far from the place where my hyena was." She peered into the timeless twilight. The train crossed a nullah. Pomper, pomper, pomper was the sound that the wheels made as they trundled over the bridge, moving very slowly. 100 yards on came a second nullah, then a third, suggesting the neighborhood of higher ground. "Perhaps this is mine. Anyhow, the road runs parallel with the railway." Her accident was a pleasant memory. She felt, in her dry, honest way, that it had given her a good shake-up and taught her Ronnie's true worth. Then she went back to her plans. Plans had been a passion with her from girlhood. Now and then she paid tribute to the present, said how friendly and intelligent Aziz was, ate a guava, couldn't eat a fried sweet, practiced her Urdu on the servant. But her thoughts ever veered to the manageable future and to the Anglo-Indian life she had decided to endure. And as she appraised it with its adjuncts of Turtons and Burtons, the train accompanied her sentences. Pomper, pomper. The train, half asleep, going nowhere in particular and with no passenger of importance in any of its carriages, the branch line train, lost on a low embankment between dull fields. Its message, for it had one, avoided her well-equipped mind. Far away behind her, with a shriek that meant business, rushed the mail, connecting up important towns such as Calcutta and Lahore, where interesting events occur and personalities are developed. She understood that. Unfortunately, India has few important towns. India is the country, fields, fields, then hills, jungle, hills, and more fields. The branch line stops, the road is only practicable for cars to a point, the bullock carts lumber down the side tracks, paths fray out into the cultivation and disappear near a splash of red paint. How can the mind take hold of such a country? Generations of invaders have tried, but they remain in exile. The important towns they build are only retreats, their quarrels the malaise of men who cannot find their way home. India knows of their trouble. She knows of the whole world's trouble to its uttermost depth. She calls come through her 100 mouths, through objects ridiculous and august. But come to what? She has never defined. She is not a promise, only an appeal. I will fetch you from Simla when it's cool enough. I will unbottle you, in fact, continued the reliable girl. We then see some of the Mogul stuff, how appalling if we let you miss the Taj, and then I will see you off at Bombay. Your last glimpse of this country really shall be interesting. But Mrs. Moore had fallen asleep, exhausted by the early start. She was in rather low health and ought not to have attempted the expedition, but had pulled herself together in case the pleasure of the others would suffer. Her dreams were of the same texture, but there it was her other children who were wanting something, Stella and Ralph, and she was explaining to them that she could not be in 2 families at once. When she awoke, Adela had ceased to plan and leant out of a window, saying, "They're rather wonderful." Astonishing, even from the rise of the civil station, here the Marabar were gods, to whom earth is a ghost. Kawa Dol was nearest. It shot up in a single slab on whose summit one rock was poised, if a mass so great can be called one rock. Behind it, recumbent, were the hills that contained the other caves, isolated each from his neighbour by broad channels of the plain. The assemblage, 10 in all, shifted a little as the train crept past them, as if observing its arrival. "I'd not have missed this for anything," said the girl, exaggerating her enthusiasm. "Look, the sun's rising. This will be absolutely magnificent. Come quickly, look. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. We should never have seen it if we'd stuck to the Turtons and their eternal elephants." As she spoke, the sky to the left turned angry orange. Colour throbbed and mounted behind a pattern of trees, grew in intensity, was yet brighter, incredibly brighter, strained from without against the globe of the air. They awaited the miracle, but at the supreme moment when night should have died and day lived, nothing occurred. It was as if virtue had failed in the celestial fount. The hues in the east decayed, the hills seemed dimmer, though in fact better lit, and a profound disappointment entered with the morning breeze. Why, when the chamber was prepared, did the bridegroom not enter with trumpets and shawms, as humanity expects? The sun rose without splendour. He was presently observed trailing yellowish behind the trees, or against insipid sky, and touching the bodies already at work in the fields. "Ah, that must be the false dawn. Isn't it caused by dust in the upper layers of the atmosphere that couldn't fall down during the night? I think Mr. McBride said so. Well, I must admit that England has it as regards sunrises. Do you remember Grasmere? Ah, dearest Grasmere. Its little lakes and mountains were beloved by them all, romantic yet manageable. It sprang from a kindlier planet. Here, an untidy plain stretched to the knees of the Marabar. "Good morning, good morning! Put on your topies," shouted Aziz from farther down the train. "Put on your topies at once. The early sun is highly dangerous for heads. I speak as a doctor." Good morning, good morning. Put on your own." "Not for my thick head," he laughed, banging it and holding up pads of his hair. Nice creature he is, murmured Adela. Listen, Mohammed Latif says good morning next. Various pointless jests. Dr. Aziz, what's happening to your heels? The train has forgotten to stop. Perhaps it is a circular train and goes back to Chandrapur without a break. Who knows? Having wandered off into the plain for a mile, the train slowed up against an elephant. There was a platform too, but it shriveled into insignificance. An elephant waving her painted forehead at the morn. Oh, what a surprise, called the ladies politely. Aziz said nothing, but he nearly burst with pride and relief. The elephant was the one grand feature of the picnic, and God alone knew what he had gone through to obtain her. Semi-official, she was best approached through the Nawab Bahadur, who was best approached through Nureddin, but he never answered letters, but his mother had great influence with him and was a friend of Hamidullah's Begum's, who had been excessively kind and had promised to call on her provided the broken shutter of the Purdah carriage came back soon enough from Calcutta. That an elephant should depend from so long and so slender a string filled Aziz with content and with humorous appreciation of the East, where the friends of friends are a reality, where everything gets done sometime, and sooner or later everyone gets his share of happiness. And Mohammed Latif was likewise content because 2 of the guests had missed the train, and consequently he could ride on the howdah instead of following in a cart. And the servants were content because an elephant increased their self-esteem, and they tumbled out the luggage into the dust with shouts and bangs, issuing orders to one another and convulsed with goodwill. It takes an hour to get there, an hour to get back, and 2 hours for the caves, which we will call 3, said Aziz, smiling charmingly. There was suddenly something regal about him. The train back is at 11:30, and you will be sitting down to your tiffin in Chandrapur with Mr. Heaslop at exactly your usual hour, namely 1:15. I know everything about you. 4 hours, quite a small expedition, and an hour extra for misfortunes, which occur somewhat frequently among my people. My idea is to plan everything without consulting you, but you, Mrs. Moore, or Miss Quested, you are at any moment to make alterations if you wish, even if it means giving up the caves. Do you agree? Then mount this wild animal. The elephant had knelt, grey and isolated, like another hill. They climbed up the ladder, and he mounted shikar fashion, treading first on the sharp edge of the heel, and then into the looped-up tail. When Mohammed Latif followed him, the servant who held the end of the tail let go of it, according to previous instructions, so that the poor relative slipped and had to cling to the netting over the buttocks. It was a little piece of court buffoonery, and distressed only the ladies, whom it was intended to divert. Both of them disliked practical jokes. Then the beast rose in 2 shattering movements and poised them 10 feet above the plain. Immediately below was the scurf of life that an elephant always collects around its feet: villagers, naked babies. The servants flung crockery into tongas. Hassan annexed the stallion intended for Aziz and defied Mahmud Ali's man from its altitude. The Brahmin who had been hired to cook for Professor Godbole was planted under an acacia tree to await their return. The train, also hoping to return, wobbled away through the fields, turning its head this way and that like a centipede. And the only other movement to be seen was a movement as of antennae, really the counterpoises of the wells, which rose and fell on their pivots of mud all over the plain and dispersed a feeble flow of water. The scene was agreeable rather than not in the mild morning air, but there was little colour in it and no vitality. As the elephant moved towards the hills, the pale sun had by this time saluted them to the base and penciled shadows down their creases, a new quality occurred, a spiritual silence which invaded more senses than the ear. Life went on as usual, but had no consequences. That is to say, sounds did not echo or thoughts develop. Everything seemed cut off at its root, and therefore infected with illusion. For instance, there were some mounds by the edge of the track, low, serrated, and touched with whitewash. What were these mounds? Graves? Breasts of the goddess Parvati? The villagers beneath gave both replies. Again, there was a confusion about a snake, which was never cleared up. Miss Quested saw a thin, dark object reared on end at the farther side of a watercourse and said, "A snake!" The villagers agreed, and Aziz explained, yes, a black cobra, very venomous, who had reared himself up to watch the passing of the elephant. But when she looked through Ronnie's field glasses, she found it wasn't a snake, but the withered and twisted stump of a toddy palm. So she said, "It isn't a snake." The villagers contradicted her. She had put the word into their minds, and they refused to abandon it. Aziz admitted that it looked like a tree through the glasses, but insisted that it was a black cobra really, and improvised some rubbish about protective mimicry. Nothing was explained, and yet there was no romance. Films of heat radiated from the Kawadol precipices increased the confusion. They came at regular intervals and moved capriciously. A patch of field would jump as if it was being fried and then lie quiet. As they drew closer, the radiation stopped. The elephant walked straight at the Kawadol as if she would knock for admission with her forehead, then swerved and followed a path round its base. The stones plunged straight into the earth like cliffs into the sea, and while Miss Quested was remarking on this and saying that it was striking, the plane quietly disappeared, peeled off, so to speak, and nothing was to be seen on either side but the granite, very dead and quiet. The sky dominated, as usual, but seemed unhealthily near, adhering like a ceiling to the summits of the precipices. It was as if the contents of the corridor had never been changed. Occupied by his own munificence, Aziz noticed nothing. His guests noticed a little. They did not feel that it was an attractive place or quite worth visiting, and wished it could have turned into something like a Mohammedan object, such as a mosque, which their host would have appreciated and explained. His ignorance became evident and was really rather a drawback. In spite of his gay, confident talk, he had no notion how to treat this particular aspect of India. He was lost in it without Professor Godbole, like themselves. The corridor narrowed, then widened into a sort of tray. Here, more or less, was their goal. A ruined tank held a little water, which would do for the animals, and close above the mud was punched a black hole, the first of the caves. 3 hills encircled the tray. 2 of them pumped out heat busily, but the third was in shadow, and here they camped. "A horrid, stuffy place, really," murmured Mrs. Moore to herself. We will hear the second part of chapter 14 tomorrow. And then we'll skip Monday and resume on Tuesday. But until I see you all tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram, I hope everyone stays very, very well. Good night.